make Charlie your father, Bibbs. You can't do that, can you? I am not saying he's a great man. Willie Loman never earned a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived. But he's a human being. And a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He must not be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. You called him crazy?
Mom, I didn't...
Wait a minute. A lot of people think he's lost his balance, but you don't have to be very smart to know what his trouble is. The man is exhausted.
Sure.
A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man.
Is it Linda, Charlie and Bernard, Charlie or Bernard, Ben, Miss Frances? Is it anyone? A spirited debate. According to Emily, quote, there was really no specific character that stood out from the actions such as Abrams and Harpham require. Most respondents, however, felt that they could make a case. Brenton gets the ball rolling. If one were to identify a choral character in Death of a Salesman, Linda could be a potential option. Linda properly stands apart, which is one of those requirements mentioned by Abrams and Harpham. She is a bystander. She also provides norms by which to understand and judge the action and principal actors. She provides what Abrams and Harpham require, perspective. As Brenton says, quote, she is principally seen just commenting on Willie's condition, protecting him or offering him support. She does not, for example, go visit Howard or physically prevent Willie's departure on his last fatal night. Do note how her expressions of sympathy could become so-called speech acts that change the course of the play, which is a no-no for a choral character. And I think the other things that Brent mentioned at the end of his statement, the end of that one sentence, the business about protecting Willie, offering Willie support, verge upon a kind of action in the play that would not be proper for the choral character. Joseph wonders about this issue. Quote, is she somewhat too involved emotionally with Willie and her sons? Is her perspective not unique, not objective, not apart from that of Willie's own? In which case, Charlie and Bernard, as Maria notes, and Lindsay mentions Charlie's outtakes. Charlie, for example, may seem a better candidate, or even Ben, or even Miss Frances. As Maria says, Linda is a, quote, victim. She's too involved in the action for us to be able to think of her as an independent commentator, even if she is capable of offering independent commentary appropriate to a chorus. Amira pushes back. Choral characters are, quote, commentators on the dramatic actions and events who express traditional moral, religious, and social attitudes. Linda's emotional reactions are expressions of the traditional social attitude of the wife and mother whom she is. Should we, though? Should we distinguish between social and, say, familial? The question arises, can we be choruses? Can we serve as choruses to our own families and our own family dramas? You ever felt as if one? Maybe after Thanksgiving dinner? In any event, invoking Hawthorne's notion of social otherness, a wonderful phrase, isn't it? Joseph makes a strong case for Charlie and Bernard. Charlie retains independence even as, quote, events start to escalate, to a degree that Linda cannot and does not. Note Charlie's refrain about growing up. Brandy calls her attention to the sense of irony Charlie brings properly. Denise does too, but also finds him sympathetic. Charlie knows Willie well, just as traditional choruses tend to know the history of the crayons and the Oedipuses and the Antigones, being de facto community archivists of sorts. Brandy finds Charlie to be a properly choral, quote, voice of reason and practicality in a world of delusion and confusion. Now, Denise, provocatively, names Happy, despite being ignored by Linda and Biff. Happy responds in order to defend Willie. Quote, Charlie never had to cope with what he's got to, something that Happy says. Quote, Happy continuously gives commentary throughout the play that offers a different perspective of the ongoing situations. Continuously. Do you agree? And does his commentary exhibit that, quote, social otherness that Hawthorne requires of his choral voices? Is he a little too close to Willie to offer a, quote, different perspective? Brenton finds Happy pushing a lot of false appearances and lies, mirroring his father. He also finds him to be one of the actors, the active participants in the play, Choral characters, our authorities appear to agree. But wait, see the next plate. Choral characters, our authorities begin to agree, must be bystanders. But wait, as I just said, anticipating the next plate. So let's go there. Okay, wait a second, time out. Let's just take a moment here, okay, to make an important point. Of course, to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all, is that not to do something innovative? Isn't it a stretch? Isn't it to stretch a rule of the genre? Isn't it to modify a convention? I want to introduce this notion of a literary convention, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit below, right? It's been said that the chorus, which sees Clytemnestra in the play Agamemnon, which is one of the great Greek tragedies, it's been said that the chorus in that play, which sees Clytemnestra, knife in hand, approach Agamemnon as he sits in his bath, is not allowed to warn him. Okay, bearing witness to what's about to happen, they're not allowed to rush in and save him. It's just against the rules. Choruses can't do things like that. Okay, they can't be involved. It's not a matter of their simply not being involved. It goes against the convention, the literary, as it were, kind of unspoken agreement and expectation, okay, of authors who write in these particular genres. But think about what happens when we get more modern, right? And you get the feeling that a lot of these old genres, they're not being scrapped. They're being, in various ways, investigated and modified and kind of exploited is maybe the best word for them, right? What do we have, for example, in trifles? I want you to think about this. Imagine that the two women, you remember them, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, a chorus of two. Imagine them as the chorus of that play. That was originally going to be one of your items. Well, for whatever reason. A chorus of two uniting in the end to save a small t tragic heroine, Mrs. Wright, simply, if I think quite devilishly, by resuming choral convention and refusing to intervene in the action. Kind of go back to being a chorus, right? Start out maybe as a chorus, nobody's paying much attention to them. They're offering community commentary. You see the men there in the, on the scene early on as constituting a kind of competitive chorus, a rival chorus made of the men, which I think is a very interesting way of reading the play, right? Maybe with the possible exception of the district commissioner, right, or the DA, as it were, who was actually doing the investigating, right? He seems a little bit too involved, but the other two are just there to kind of offer statements, right? The women seem to be that as well, and you can imagine the play continuing with the two of them kind of falling into the background and showing up now and then to offer comments, to say this, to say that. But in fact, we see them take the stage, take center stage. Mrs. Wright is off stage. Tragedy is off stage. And we have this kind of subsection of tragedy, which features choral characters, if you will, right? Who, in fact, to the extent that there's any action in the play, they're the ones who act. And there's not much action in the play. I mean, all they really do is look in a bag, find something that's dead, and decide to leave it there, right? Even as they comment upon it. Let me reread that sentence. Resuming choral convention, this chorus of two, uniting in the end to resume choral convention and refuse to intervene in the action, which they could have done by presenting the dead bird to the men, even as they comment upon it, okay? Even as they, throughout, and I think even at the very end, are commenting upon the action. They, at the end, could, that's consistent throughout, but at the end, they could go back to just a commentary, right? Just the function of commentary is their only function at the very end. And you can see this as a devilish bit of fun. The topic isn't fun, but aesthetically, you can imagine that a glass bell is, in fact, doing some very interesting things here that are fairly playful in their own way, okay? So here's a generalization. Modern plays monkey with a convention. It's a pretty simple point, but I think it's a good one, right? And one that's very worth bearing in mind as we try to understand literary history and try to prepare ourselves to be English majors whose careers are going to be investigations of literary history. Modern plays monkey with the conventions. These long established rules of the genre get played with, monkeyed around with moderns who want to write something like a tragedy, right? But don't feel that the old style, the old form is precisely fits what they're up to. Note how they do not, here's an important distinction. Note how these modern plays do not reject or ignore those conventions. Even if they do not venerate and obey them, they don't reject or ignore them. That's not the way to do it. That's not the way to get yourself taken seriously. It would appear when we look at literary history, you don't ignore, reject wholesale, right? You invoke and then transform. That seems to be the way to do it. And again, it speaks to the staying power of genre as much as it does to anything else, which was the whole point of our the last video, right? Was one of the big points of the last video was this remarkable staying power and stability of genre. At the same time, mutability of genre, the mutability and longevity of genre. Stability in some sort of essential core is stable, right, of these genres, even as they undergo this mutation. So they're still recognizable as tragedy or the tragic mode, but nobody would say that that's a Greek tragedy when you read Trifles, or you read Chekhov, or you read this play. Just let me note in passing what's down here, and I hope it's legible, which is in accordance with that star up above just after the first sentence. The first sentence was, but of course to have your chorus or choral character affect the hero's actions at all is to do something innovative, right? Well, do note how some critics think that an evidently passive and at best reactive Greek chorus, such as we have in Antigone, is more active and evolved than we tend to recognize. You know, in other words, that fundamental premise of the inactivity of the chorus is something that some critics have called into question. I don't feel that they have done so all that compellingly, but it's still a very interesting claim. Hawthorne, for example, notes how many critics have long recognized how the chorus in Greek tragedies may be clearly, quote, clearly and directly involved in the action by doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. And Hawthorne goes on to say, look, even when they're silent, they're just standing there, they make a difference. They're in a sense involved in the action. Yeah, but others, you know, they'll retort such things, right? That line, doing such things as arguing, supplicating, or deceiving. Well, these things, aren't they to be distinguished from things like burying, issuing decrees, committing suicide, right? Drawing your sword on your father, as Hymen does, right? I mean, there's certain actions that are really actions. Then there are other actions that are kind of like if you stretch, you know, when the Greek chorus wants to get into a discussion about with Crayon about the lawfulness of what he's doing, okay? And they end up celebrating some of the things that some of his premises and whatnot. Is that really action at the same level as what Hymen is doing when he draws his sword? So, you know, you have an argument about this. You have a debate on this whole question of whether that convention, as we recognize it, is really there, okay? But I think the consensus is that there is a difference between what a choral character is doing on a stage and what a non-choral character who's involved in the action is doing on the stage. For fans of Miss Frances and of Ben, perhaps, as candidates or nominees for the choral character, Barazzato and Catrombone might come to your assistance. They argue that choral groups assume different intra-dramatic, which means within the drama itself, identities according to the specific plots in which they partake. A similar attention to the choral intra-dramatic identity, which just means the identity taken up by the chorus in whatever drama he or she or it happens to be a part of, has provided a strong corrective against those interpreters who make too straightforward identifications between the tragic chorus and the civic collectivity, which is something we've been doing, right? That's what I was talking about before when I said I don't know about Miss Frances or I don't know about Ben, because what do they represent? Aren't they a bit elliptical and eccentric and a bit out there, as I said, a bit far out, right? Spatially, economically, socially. Arguing against such politicizing views of the tragic chorus, the famous Gold in 1996 convincingly maintains that tragic choruses quite often embody social groups that were perceived as marginal within Athenian 5th century
society. So if you go back again, go back to the original convention as it was established by the Greeks, and you might find that there are, that there's a kind of a range of possibility with respect to the relationship between the chorus and the community surrounding the action of the play, right? Now, in Antigone, there's no doubt about it. They are like elders. They're referred to as old men, you will recall. They're like the city fathers. They're like the guys at the barbershop, but probably if one of the guys at the barbershop is also mayor of the town, right? That's who they are in Antigone, and that's who they are in lots of Greek tragedies. Okay, but every now and then, as Gold argues, you get them representing something that's a little bit off, a little bit eccentric, a little bit out there, right? The chorus. And it's interesting. There isn't a one-to-one match between the chorus necessarily, even when you go back to the Greeks, in every tragedy between the chorus and the surrounding, fairly conventional-minded, okay, community. And I think that's really interesting to keep that open as a possibility here of, for example, Miss Frances, whom you see here in a certain production of the play, being kind of romanced by Willie, and how would that scornful laugh, as some of you said, might itself constitute a choral comment. Where we've been heading this whole time is towards a concept, or a notion at least, of the literary convention and the power of conventions. I think this is no surprise to you if you're still with me. To quote the Abrams and Harpham glossary, they have a wonderful, wonderfully helpful entry on this question. Quote, conventions are conspicuous features of subject matter, form, or technique that occur repeatedly in works of literature. Conventions, in a sense, may be recurrent types of character, choral character, turns of plot, reversal of the old tragedy, forms of versification, the sonnet, or kinds of diction and style, iambic pentameter in poetry. Stock characters such as the Elizabethan braggart soldier, or the languishing and fainting heroine of Victorian fiction, or the sad young men of the lost generation novels of the 1920s, were among the conventions of their literary eras. And it's interesting how that Elizabethan braggart soldier is still around. I mean, look at, I don't know about Band of Brothers, but look at, for example, Saving Private Ryan, and the character played by Edward, I almost said Norton, what's his last name? You know the guy I'm talking about. He plays the guy with the big gun who complains a lot. And he might not be the best example of the braggart, but I think I don't know, Saving Private Ryan, maybe it's the character is the sniper, right? But you have these conventional figures who are still with us, right? Who were introduced a long time ago. To continue, the abrupt reform of the villain at the end of the last act was a common convention of melodrama. Euphuism, which is high and flowery language in prose, and the Petrarchan and metaphysical conceits in verse were conventional devices of style. It is now just as much a matter of literary convention to be outspoken on sexual matters as it was to be reticent in the age of Charles Dickens and George Eliot. So these conventions do change. It's over time, as we've seen, there's a kind of mutability of literary genre and a mutability of literary convention as well. But I think what's would have been a better note to end on here, it seems to me, would have been how stable they are over time, even though, of course, there are all kinds of innovations upon them and changes and mutations. It's remarkable how you can still find them from very earlier works. They don't just get scrapped every generation and we form a whole new set of them. It's not the way it works. Yeah, a final word on conventions. You associate the word convention probably with the word, the adjective conventional, which is not necessarily a term of approbation. When I think of very conventional people I know, I tend to think of them as fairly shallow people. They just observe the rules, and they do what they've been told to do, and they do what they've been taught to do, and they don't innovate, and they don't invent, okay? Here's what Harpham and Abrams have to say on that topic. Quote, invention was originally a term used in theories of rhetoric and later in literary criticism to signify the finding of the subject matter by an orator or a poet. It then came to signify innovative elements in a work, in contrast to the deliberate imitation of the forms and subjects of prior literary models. And you can see how that would work to the extent that you're imitative of forms and subjects of prior literary models, you're being very conventional. At the present time, invention is often opposed to convention in sense 2 above, which is the sense that was quoted in the previous plate, to signify the inauguration by a writer of an unprecedented subject or theme or form or style, and the resulting work is said to possess originality. Who would not want to be thought an original, right? So does that mean you need to be very inventive, give yourself over to invention, and try to be as unconventional as possible. Try not to observe conventions. Try to reject all the conventions, right? Is that the way it works? Repeatedly in the history of literature, innovative writers such as John Donne, Walt Whitman, James Joyce, or Virginia Woolf rebel against reigning conventions of their time to produce highly original works, only to have their inventions imitated by other writers, who thereby convert literary novelties into an additional set of literary conventions. And I think we've already seen some evidence of this when we're talking about genre, right? Where what looked to be this kind of mutation that was taking us pretty far outside of the province of recognizable tragedy ends up becoming this thing called, by way of its approach to comedy, this thing called tragicomedy, and has its own set of literary conventions that grow up in its own, what seemed to be a brand new and distinct field, that had nothing to do, and scorn the whole notion of a convention, the whole notion of a genre, suddenly becomes a genre in its own right with its own set of conventions. Okay, and you even look at Joyce and Woolf and Whitman and Donne, and I think what you'll see is, yes, there's radical innovation, but at the same time, once again, their innovations are such that you can see the conventions that they're transforming and transmogrifying. Okay, you can see them. You can see the conventions there. It's not as though it's just written in a vacuum, as though there's been no history whatsoever. And here Harfam and Abrams go on to say something similar to what I just said. There's nothing either good or bad in the extent or obviousness of conformity to pre-existing conventions. All depends on the effectiveness of the use an individual writer makes of them. The pastoral elegy, for example, is one of the most conspicuously convention-bound of literary forms. Yet in Lycidas, John Milton achieved what, by wide critical agreement, ranks as one of the greatest lyrics in the language. He did this by employing the ancient pastoral rituals, but not just imitating them. He imitated them, and he transformed them and employed them with freshness, a kind of newness and novelty and power, so as to absorb an individual's death into the universal human experience and to add to his voice the resonance of earlier pastoral laments for a poet who died young. So he very much wanted his voice to be heard as a kind of echo, okay, for all its own pitch, its own novel, unique pitch and tone and timbre. He didn't want you to forget about the voices that went before, that were heard before in the tradition. He wanted to line up his voice as the latest instance of that kind of expression of voice, that kind of pitch and timbre in tenor, okay? And so, once again, I think it shows the extent to which literary innovation, literary innovation and tradition kind of split the difference between them, right? And you rarely see a literary innovation that really takes hold of, us and becomes powerful, okay, and becomes compelling, right? Except by way of its own, well, by way, number one, of the fact that it's, or the degree to which it itself gets imitated, therefore showing the power of imitation, the power of convention, or by showing that, or rather, you see it in its power by the degree to which, in fact, it participates in this kind of tradition and does not forget previous literary conventions, okay, even as it innovates upon them. But in fact, the emphasis becomes or falls on that, upon them, right, upon the foundations that exist already. That's the way literary history tends to work. Now, this video has been going on long enough, so I'm going to let you go at this point. Just to mention that Trofimov, okay, who a picture of whom, Ethan Hawke. You thought it was Ethan Hawke. No, that was Trofimov in the last plate. Okay. Those of you who responded to Trofimov, prompt will have a separate, not a video, but a separate little item devoted to what the good work that you did. Okay, so farewell for now.